Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland smells like bleach cut with something softer, the lavender soap someone keeps refilling in the break room, as if fragrance could mask what happens in these corridors. Brooke Sullivan moves through the cardiac unit on the morning of her 7th year, and nobody notices her. This is exactly how she designed it. She passes room 341 without breaking stride. The monitor there beeps its steady rhythm, and her hands move through the forecheck with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory built in places where mistakes meant funerals. Her scrubs are navy blue, pressed, forgettable. Her badge photo shows a woman with flat eyes. The tattoo on her inner forearm, a date in faded ink, 2016, stays hidden under her sleeve cuff, and she adjusts it with her pinky finger every time she leans toward a patient. The break room empties when she enters. She's learned not to pretend this surprises her anymore. She pours black coffee into a mug that says Namaste and never uses the cream. 7 minutes, she counts. 7 minutes to absorb the quiet before returning to the unit. Her locker stands at the far end, near the industrial freezer where someone has been stealing yogurt for 3 weeks. Inside, tucked behind her spare scrubs and a sweater she never wears, a faded unit patch is sewn into the lining of an old army jacket. Cotton the color of aged skin, rank insignia that nobody here would recognize, stitched with the precision of someone who'd done it in a Humvee by red light after a 17-hour extraction. She touches it once. Not every time. Once per shift, like a prayer that still works even though she stopped believing in those things in Baghdad. Her phone doesn't ring. It never does. The number that calls is classified, a Pentagon direct line that she deleted from her contacts 3 years ago. The silence suits her. Dr. Marcus Sterling arrives at Sacred Heart at 6:22 a.m., 3 minutes after his personal trainer texts him photos of his chest definition in his hospital mirror. His 42 wears a Rolex that costs more than most nurses make in 2 months, and has built a reputation for efficiency metrics that make administrators give speeches about his department at hospital conferences. His residents follow him like remirers, and the nursing staff straightens their spines when he rounds. He reviews the overnight reports on his tablet, admission numbers, discharge rates, protocol compliance, and none of it mentions the quiet woman checking vitals in room 343. Brooke sees him coming, the way she sees everything now: peripheral vision, threat assessment, exit routes. Sterling moves like a man who's never questioned whether the room wanted him there. His stethoscope costs more than her month's rent. His shoes are leather Italian, and they click against the tile floor in a rhythm that announces authority before he speaks. He glances at her once, the navy scrubs, the flat expression, the hands that move with mechanical efficiency, and dismisses her before his brain finishes the assessment. She's the kind of nurse every hospital has, competent enough not to die, quiet enough to be invisible, the one who never asks for anything and never causes problems. He doesn't see the woman who once carried a 240-pound sergeant through mortar fire while bleeding from a fragmentation wound in her leg. The residents scatter ahead of him like fish detecting a shadow. Room 347 is the last stop on morning rounds, and when Sterling pushes through the door, a man the size of a refrigerator with bandages wrapping his midsection lifts his head from the pillow. Jake Morrison. Army Ranger, post-op day 3, abdominal trauma from a training accident that Sterling's file describes in clinical language that makes it sound like Morrison had merely stubbed his toe. The chart says complications were minimal. The chart is written by people who didn't see the lacerated spleen or the blood loss that stopped being theoretical somewhere between the ambulance and the CT scanner. Morrison's eyes are the color of wet concrete, and they track Sterling's movement with the instinctive awareness of a man trained to recognize threats. But the morphine haze is thick this morning, his third request for more pain management denied because Sterling believes in something he calls responsible recovery, and the focus slides away before the recognition can sharpen. His hands rest on top of the blanket, scarred across the knuckles, calloused in the specific pattern that comes from gripping rifle stocks and rope. A tattoo on his left forearm reads a date, 2016. The same date that Brooke has inked on her own skin, in the same faded blue-black, the specific kind of permanent mark that means something changed forever on that day in a place that still tastes like diesel fuel when she closes her eyes. Brooke enters with Morrison's morning medications in a small paper cup. She doesn't look at Sterling. She's learned that eye contact with authority figures creates expectations, and expectations are how people remember you. She moves to the fall line, checks the saline drip with 2 fingers against the tube, and whispers something to Morrison that Sterling can't hear. Whatever she says makes him nod, and his shoulders relax slightly. Sterling notices this, the subtle shift in his patient's behavior, but he files it away without analysis. Just a nurse doing the basic comfort work that all of them do, the invisible labor that makes hospitals run without anyone remembering the names of the women who do it. What Sterling doesn't notice is that Brooke's hands have stopped trembling. They move with the steadiness of someone who's done this 10,000 times under worse conditions. Her voice, when she speaks to Morrison, carries a tone of absolute certainty that his pain will improve when the morphine reaches peak concentration. She says it like someone who's managed field trauma in a combat hospital where the alternative to managing pain was watching people suffer into shock. The mandatory staff meeting is called for 2 p.m. Sterling sends the email at 11:43 a.m., copying the hospital administrator and 3 other department heads. The subject line reads, "Protocol compliance and workflow optimization, immediate discussion required." Brooke sees it on the break room computer screen while she's checking her schedule. She reads it twice. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like angry wasps trapped behind plastic, and somewhere down the hall, a heart monitor picks up its pace. She closes the browser and returns to her shift without changing her expression. Sterling has been studying the efficiency metrics for 48 hours. The numbers show that certain procedures, specifically the preoperative protocols he implemented 2 years ago, are delaying surgeries by an average of 18 minutes per case. 18 minutes per case, across 487 cases per year, equals 146,700 lost minutes annually. That's 2,445 lost hours. That's a problem that shows up on quarterly reviews, and Sterling's quarterly reviews determine his salary increase, his prestige, his position on the administrative track that leads to chief of surgery within 5 years. Someone in yesterday's morning rounds had suggested, in the softest possible voice, that the preoperative protocols might be delaying critical surgeries without improving patient outcomes. The suggestion came from the cardiac unit, from a nurse whose name Sterling would have to check his files to remember. Her tone had been deferential, respectful of the hierarchy, careful not to directly contradict, but the implication landed: the protocols were unnecessary. The protocols were his idea. The protocols were now the problem. Sterling does not appreciate people who identify problems with his ideas in front of an audience. He prepares the meeting with the precision of a man building a case. The efficiency data goes on slide 4. The patient safety metrics, all of which show 0 complications, go on slide 5. The cost analysis that proves his protocols have reduced post-operative infection rates by 3.2% goes on slide 6. By the time he's done, he'll have numbers to support every decision he's ever made. And if anyone suggests that those numbers might be incomplete, or that the protocols might be improved, or that another perspective might have merit, then Sterling will ask them to cite their sources, their evidence, their credentials, their experience managing a department of 147 staff members and 12,000 annual patient contacts. He'll be reasonable. He'll be data-driven. He'll be absolutely unassailable. The meeting room fills at 1:58 p.m. Brooke enters at 2:04, taking a chair at the back, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Sterling begins his presentation. The slides click past, numbers climbing, percentages shifting, the narrative of a department running at peak efficiency. He mentions protocol compliance twice. He mentions workflow optimization 4 times. He never mentions anyone by name. He doesn't have to. By the time he finishes, he has already removed the person who challenged him from the equation. She's sitting 3 rows ahead, taking notes on a piece of lined paper, and she has no idea that she's already been categorized as a problem requiring elimination. The next words out of his mouth will change everything. The conference room at Sacred Heart smelled like stale coffee and the particular silence that comes before someone's world changes. Dr. Sterling stood at the podium with a clicker in his hand, the kind of man whose presence made the air pressure change. His jawline could cut glass. Behind him, a projector cast a slide in Arial font, "Deficiency obstacles." 20 nurses sat in folding chairs, and Brooke Sullivan occupied the back row, hands folded in her lap, taking notes on lined paper in a handwriting so precise it looked like machine-generated output. Sterling clicked to the next slide. Pre-op protocol times. A bar chart in red. 42 minutes average, he said, his voice smooth as diesel exhaust. Before surgical incision. Before we even begin. That's our obstacle. He leaned against the podium. My 3-tier pre-op assessment protocol is evidence-based best practice. Physician sign-off. Secondary verification. Tertiary documentation. That's what separates Sacred Heart from the strip mall clinics. Someone laughed. Nobody else joined in. The issue is compliance. Some staff seem to think their personal judgment trumps medical evidence. Brooke raised her hand. Not aggressively. Not with certainty. With the kind of tentative motion a ghost makes, present but apologetic for existing. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He nodded. For critical surgeries, Brooke said quietly, her voice steady as a surgical laser, the redundant physician sign-offs delay OR access. She glanced down at her notes. I tracked it. For weeks of data. Average 40-minute delay for emergency cases. We're talking about patients bleeding out while we verify the verification. The room went dead silent. One nurse's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. Someone in the third row shifted their weight. Sterling's face flushed. Not red. Scarlet. The kind of color that precedes violence. I'm sorry, he said, clicking his pen twice, 3 times. Who has the medical degree here? Anyone. He waited. The silence stretched like a held breath. Because I seem to recall spending 4 years in medical school and another 5 in residency. How long is nursing school again? 2 years? And you've been here, what, 20 months? Brooke said nothing. This was the calculation she'd already made. The math of survival. Smaller than yourself. Invisible. Accept the blow and move. I don't need input on my protocols, Sterling continued, his voice dropping to something that sounded like a threat wearing a smile. I need compliance. This meeting is over. He clicked off the projector. The slide vanished. People gathered their notebooks, uncomfortable in the way humans are when someone's dignity has been weaponized in public. Brooke remained seated, hands still folded, until everyone else had filed out. 3 days later, Sterling was conducting rounds with Morrison's family present, his daughter Emily, a 32-year-old attorney with her father's eyes, and a son in scrubs from his own department. Sterling approached Morrison's wound with a dressing change, removing the old gauze with movements that suggested he'd done this 10,000 times and been bored for 9,999 of them. Brooke was charting at the bedside station. Standard protocol, Sterling announced to Emily, is to allow 24-hour intervals before redressing. Ensures optimal healing matrix. Brooke looked up from her notes. She set the pen down. The laceration pattern on this injury, she said, her voice carrying no inflection whatsoever, runs perpendicular to the fascia. 24 hours risks bacterial colonization in the subcutaneous layer. 18-hour intervals with chlorhexidine wash would reduce infection probability by approximately 30%. Sterling turned slowly. His movements were controlled, deliberate, the kind of precise that indicated he was making a decision about something. When he spoke, his voice was cordial. Dangerous. Nurse Sullivan, he said, perhaps you'd like to lead rounds today. Oh wait. You can't. Because you're a nurse. Morrison's son looked down at his own hands. Emily's jaw tightened. The fluorescent lights hummed above them like insects. I don't know what kind of sloppy shop you worked at before, Ghost, the nickname landed hard, a deliberate cut, but here we follow physician judgment. Period. Not suggestions. Not opinions. Physician judgment. he turned back to Morrison's wound and continued the dressing change with movements that were technically correct and medically inferior, performing his authority like a play performed for an audience of one, himself. Brooke took one measured breath. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. But a single tear escaped her left eye, the kind of tear that appears when someone has been holding pressure on a wound too long and the body finds one small place to release. She wiped it with steady fingers before it could fall again and met Sterling's gaze across Morrison's bed for exactly 2 seconds. "I've followed worse men into worse situations, Doctor," she said quietly. "I survived those too." She left the room. Behind her, Morrison's daughter stared at her father's arm, at the coordinates tattooed beneath his skin, at a name she'd never asked him about. That afternoon, Brooke entered the break room for the first time in 14 days. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Nurses gathering their lunches exchanged glances. One by one, they left, Sarah first, then Jennifer, then the 2 residents from night shift who didn't even take their food with them. Within 90 seconds, Brooke sat alone at the table with an unopened sandwich and the sound of the refrigerator humming like a mechanized heartbeat. She didn't eat. She sat there until her shift ended and then she drove to Riverview Cemetery in the rain. The headstone read, "David Sullivan, beloved husband." No dates. No epitaph. Just that. Brooke kneeled in the mud, her scrub soaking through at the knees, and pressed her forehead against the stone. The rain came down hard enough that it sounded like applause. By morning, the notice was posted. It appeared on the unit board at Sacred Heart at 6:51 a.m., laminated on hospital letterhead, positioned at eye level where everyone would see it during shift change. The font was clean. The message was not. Official notice, Brooke Sullivan, RN, written warning. Insubordination and failure to follow chain of command. Questioning physician orders in presence of patient family. Further incidents will result in termination. 12 staff members walked past it during the 7 a.m. shift change. Some lingered. Some pretended not to see it. Brooke stood before it for 45 seconds, reading every word, and Sterling watched from his office doorway with his arms crossed, not angry, but satisfied, the way someone is satisfied after they've successfully executed a plan. What happened next didn't just change Brooke's day. It activated everything Sterling had been calculating behind closed doors. At 8:53 a.m., Sterling made his first call. Board member Patricia Hendricks. The woman whose daughter he'd personally mentored through medical school. He spoke carefully, professionally, framing Brooke as a problematic hire with an incomplete work history and a potential liability exposure. Hendricks promised to look into it. By 9:15 a.m., Sterling contacted the nursing agency Brooke had used when she'd taken the Sacred Heart position 2 years ago. Routine credential verification, he said. They were happy to help. Within an hour, Sterling had a file. Employment gaps. Nothing before Portland. Just a thin resume. 2 character references. A nursing license issued the year she arrived. He printed it. Read it twice. Smiled. By noon, he'd contacted an external compliance investigator named Dr. Raymond Walsh, a man who specialized in scope of practice violations and had testified against nurses in 7 malpractice cases. Sterling explained his concerns. Nurse practicing beyond her license. Potential danger to patients. Walsh agreed to visit next week. He sounded genuinely interested. Brooke didn't know any of this yet. She just knew that her patient assignments had shifted to the least critical cases. The charge nurse avoided her eyes. Her locker had been moved to the basement level due to remodeling. There was a sticky note on her time card, "See Sterling before next shift." She didn't go. Instead, she drove to the cemetery. Morrison, meanwhile, was walking the halls with his daughter, his movements stronger each day, but something nagging at him. Something about the quiet nurse with the careful hands. He asked the floor nurse, "Who's the one with dark hair?" "Moves like." He couldn't finish. The morphine made memories slippery. Like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Emily noticed her father staring down a hallway where Brooke had just disappeared around a corner. She noticed his left forearm. The tattoo. B. Sullivan in faded black ink, surrounded by coordinates. She'd never asked him about it. "Dad," she said. "That tattoo. Your forearm." He looked down as if surprised it was still there. As if it might have faded into nothing. "Someone who saved my life," he said quietly. "Long time ago. Baghdad." Emily's attorney mind began calculating. Her father's file showed he'd served with the 75th Ranger Regiment. The tattoo was recent. Or old. It was impossible to tell. The coordinates meant nothing to her, at least not yet. But she made a mental note. The kind of note you make when something doesn't add up. Brooke, downstairs in her basement locker, folded her scrubs carefully and hung them in a row. In the back corner, hidden beneath her street clothes, was a folded unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, the insignia worn inside jacket linings during operations, faded from 7 years of being pressed against someone's chest. She'd sewn it there herself when she arrived in Portland. A reminder. A prayer. A confession that some people never stop carrying home. Dr. Sterling's office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor with a view of the Portland skyline and floor-to-ceiling windows that made everything feel exposed. He sat behind his mahogany desk at 7:30 in the evening, the hospital quieting around him, and dialed Patricia Hendricks on his personal cell. The connection crackled once before she answered. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Patricia, I need a favor regarding one of our nurses," he said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Her judgment is becoming a liability. I'm documenting everything, but I wanted you to know this is coming." Patricia's response was immediate and warm, the kind of warmth that came from decades of board-level alliance and shared golf weekends at Waverly Country Club. "Of course, Marcus. Send me the file." He smiled. One piece in place. The next morning, Sterling pulled the contact information from Brooke's hiring paperwork. The nursing agency she'd used to enter her current anonymity was called Meridian Staffing, a boutique placement firm that specialized in temporary healthcare workers and people seeking discreet career transitions. Their records were sparse, references from a single prior supervisor at a clinic in Boise, Idaho, a facility that no longer existed, and a phone number that led to a woman named Margaret Chen who spoke in measured syllables and offered only minimal confirmation that yes, she had supervised Brooke Sullivan, and yes, she was competent and reliable, nothing more. Sterling pressed gently, professionally. Was there any concern? Any reason for her departure? Margaret's pause stretched exactly 3 seconds. She was private. Skilled. That's all I can tell you. The line went dead. Sterling set the phone down and made another call, this one to Walsh & Associates, a medical credentialing firm that worked with hospitals throughout the Pacific Northwest. Thomas Walsh returned his call within 2 hours. He was expensive, meticulous, and utterly without sentiment, exactly what Sterling needed. Sterling explained the situation with careful precision, a nurse who'd questioned his clinical judgment publicly, potential scope of practice violations, employment history that seemed deliberately obscured, references that were hostile or unavailable. "I want to know everything," Sterling said. "Prior employment, military service if any, financial history, social media, family connections. Everything." Walsh's voice carried the flatness of someone who'd heard worse. "I'll need your authorization form signed and returned. My team can start preliminary background work within 24 hours. Full report in 5 to 7 business days." Sterling authorized the expenditure, $8,000 from his discretionary account, without flinching. He'd spent more on a single dinner at Ringside Steakhouse. What was $8,000 to protect an entire career? By Thursday morning, Walsh's preliminary report landed in Sterling's inbox with a subject line marked confidential. Sterling opened it in his office with the door locked and his computer screen angled away from the door's small window. The report was 12 pages. The first page summarized findings under investigation. Previous employment confirmed with Boise Clinic, 2016 to 2019. Reference is limited due to facility closure. No criminal record. Minimal financial history. No public social media presence. No prior disciplinary action at Sacred Heart beyond the current documentation. A single line near the bottom caught his attention: recommend restricted patient care duties pending compliance review. Investigation scheduled for Friday, 0900 hours. Subject should be notified of investigation parameters, scope, and timeline prior to interview. Sterling leaned back in his chair. The mechanics were simple, elegant. He would compose an email right now, professional and airtight, restricting Brooke from direct patient care pending investigation. He would copy HR, timestamp it officially, and schedule it to deliver Thursday morning at 0630 hours. By the time she arrived for her shift, the restriction would be waiting. It wasn't a firing, not yet, that was still days away, but it was a cage. It was the strategic equivalent of confiscating someone's weapon before a battle they didn't know was coming. He opened a new email and began typing, Ms. Sullivan, effective immediately, pending the outcome of an ongoing compliance review into your clinical judgment and scope of practice adherence, you are reassigned to medication inventory and supply restocking. You are to have no direct patient care responsibilities until this review is complete. HR will contact you separately regarding the timing of your formal interview. This reassignment is not disciplinary in nature but is a precautionary measure. He added the hospital logo, his typed signature, and copied Patricia Hendricks and the HR director. Professional. Documented. Airtight. He scheduled it to send at 6:31 a.m. Then he closed the laptop and poured himself 2 fingers of scotch at 10:56 in the morning, something he rarely did, and he allowed himself to smile. By Friday, everyone would know. By next week, she'd be gone. His department's efficiency metrics would rebound. The questions would stop. The threat would be eliminated. He'd learned long ago that the secret to institutional power wasn't being the loudest voice in the room, it was being the one who could make decisions happen without raising his voice at all. Brooke received the email at the nurse's station at 6:34 a.m. while checking medications for her morning rounds. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She clicked it open. Read it. Read it again. The words arranged themselves into meaning: reassigned, pending investigation, no direct patient care. Her jaw tightened but nothing else moved. A nurse passing behind her made a comment about the coffee maker being broken, and Brooke acknowledged it with a nod, her voice level. I'll call maintenance. The email sat in her inbox like a grenade with the pin still in. She didn't respond. She didn't forward it. She simply deleted it from her screen and pulled up the hospital's system to review her current patient assignments. Jake Morrison was still her patient for the next 18 hours. His post-op recovery was progressing normally. Vitals stable. Surgical site clean. The restraint order would take effect at shift change tomorrow at 1900 hours. That left her from now until then less than a full day, but enough. Enough for what? She didn't let herself ask. She just held the time in her hands like something precious and finite. The rain started that afternoon, light at first, then hard and insistent, the kind of Portland rain that sounded like static against the windows. By evening it was hammering the parking lot like applause from some invisible audience. Brooke's shift ended at 1900 hours on the dot. She'd spent the day moving between Morrison's room and the other patients in her care, her hand steady, her voice professional, every clinical detail perfect because perfection was the only armor she had left. Morrison's daughter Emily had visited mid-afternoon with her younger brother Trevor, who was flying back to Seattle in the morning. Brooke had seen them through the observation window, Emily's hand on the bed railing, the brothers talking quietly about their father's recovery, about something Brooke couldn't quite hear but understood from the tension in their shoulders. Trevor kept asking questions about their father's past, about the tattoo on his forearm. Emily was doing that thing families do when they're trying to protect someone from themselves, steering the conversation toward the present, toward healing, away from whatever ghosts their father carried. After her shift ended, Brooke didn't head toward the parking garage like the other nurses. Instead, she walked deeper into the hospital, through the corridors that led to the administrative wing, and then out through the emergency department exit into the rain. Her scrubs were thin cotton. Within minutes they clung to her skin like a second layer of regret. She drove to Riverside Cemetery on the east side of the city, her hand steady on the wheel, her breathing controlled, the kind of breathing she'd learned in SEAL training when panic wanted to kill you faster than enemy fire. David's grave sat under an old oak tree, the headstone slate grey with rain. She knelt beside it without bothering to find a dry spot. The grass was soaked. Her scrubs were already ruined. She placed her hand on the stone and her voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. I tried to be small enough to survive, baby, and I still failed. The rain fell harder, washing down her face, indistinguishable from tears. I kept my head down. I stayed invisible. I did everything right and he saw me anyway. He wanted me gone and I don't even know why. Maybe it's because I was right about the protocols. Maybe it's because I'm just the kind of person that makes people want to hurt things. She pressed her forehead against the stone. I don't know how to be anything but what I am. And what I am isn't enough to survive this quietly. The rain drummed against her shoulders, and she stayed there in the dark, kneeling at the grave of the man she'd married 17 years ago, the man who'd loved her despite everything she couldn't say, everything she still couldn't say, everything that had nothing left to survive anyway. Her hands were shaking now, trembling with something that wasn't fear. It was something older than fear. It was the knowledge that she'd already been broken once and had stitched herself together with nothing but discipline and silence, and now the stitches were coming apart and there was no one to tell about it except dead grass and a stone and the rain that didn't care. The dressing change was routine. Brooke had done it 1,000 times, sterile gauze peeled back, the wound site inspected, fresh tape applied with the economical precision of someone who'd learned efficiency meant survival. Morrison dozed in the afternoon light filtering through the hospital blinds. His oxygen saturation held steady at 97%. Heart rate 68. The kind of patient who was healing the way textbooks promised. Then his breathing changed. Shallow. Rapid. The kind of shallow that came from somewhere deep in the chest cavity, where air wasn't supposed to be. Brooke's hand stilled on the tape. She didn't look up immediately. She listened. The ventilator sound shifted, less the rhythmic wheeze of normal respiration and more the gasping of someone drowning in air. Morrison's eyes snapped open. His hand shot to his chest. Something's wrong, he said. She was already moving. The call button got pressed but her body was 3 steps ahead of the hospital protocol, already pulling the pulse oximeter closer, already reading the numbers that confirmed what her ears had told her. 97 to 89 in 30 seconds. The oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. His lips were going pale. Not the pale of normal post-op recovery but the pale of a body beginning to fail, the kind of pale she'd seen in transport helicopters over Baghdad when shrapnel had found lung tissue. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, pushing against the heart, choking off his ability to breathe. The code team was 2 floors down in Trauma 2. He had maybe 3 minutes before his heart would stop trying. Brooke moved to the crash cart. No hesitation. No moment of wondering whether this was her job or not, that had burned away the moment she recognized the symptom. The 14-gauge needle came into her hand like an old friend. She exposed Morrison's chest, found the anatomical landmarks with her fingers like reading Braille. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The spot where a needle between the ribs could let trapped air escape and save a life. Her hands were completely steady. She prepped the site with alcohol swab, the sharp alcohol smell mixing with the sterile gauze and his fear sweat. The needle went in with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory that wouldn't fade even after 7 years in a hospital uniform instead of a combat zone. Between the second and third ribs. Through the intercostal muscles. Into the pleural space. The hiss of air escaping sounded like something alive fleeing. Morrison gasped. His body seized, then relaxed. The oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed, 89 to 92 to 96, while his breathing found its rhythm again like a song resuming after an interrupted verse. Color flooded back into his face. His hand released its grip on the bed rail. The code team came through the door at the moment Brooke was withdrawing the needle. For people in blue scrubs moving like water, expecting crisis, expecting to run. They stopped. One of them, Dr. Harrison from trauma, looked at Morrison's improved vitals, then at the needle still in Brooke's hand, then at Morrison's exposed chest and the small glint of metal catching the fluorescent light. Who did the decompression? Harrison's voice was careful. Clinical. The voice of someone asking a question that mattered. I did, Brooke said. The room held for a breath. Harrison stepped closer, checked Morrison's lung sounds with his stethoscope, watched the oxygen saturation climb to 98. That saved his life, he said quietly. It wasn't a compliment. It was documentation. It was fact. Emily and Trevor burst through the door then, faces white with the particular terror of children seeing a parent in medical crisis. They'd been in the waiting room. Someone had called them. Their father was breathing. Their father was conscious. Emily's hands shook as she gripped Brooke's arm. What happened? Her voice cracked on the last syllable. Brooke explained it simply, stripping away all drama, tension pneumothorax. Air in the chest cavity. The lung was collapsing. Emergency needle decompression restored the pressure differential. He's stable now. Dr. Harrison will want imaging to confirm the lung is fully expanded, but his oxygen saturation is good and his breathing is normal. Trevor was crying. Emily stared at Brooke with the kind of intensity that suggested she was seeing something she hadn't noticed before. The moment Sterling arrived, the day changed direction entirely. He didn't run. He walked into the room with a kind of controlled pace that suggested he'd been informed by someone on his network, and he'd decided exactly how to handle this before he arrived. His eyes moved from Morrison to the crash cart to Brooke. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear it. You performed an advanced medical procedure without physician authorization. That constitutes practicing outside your scope of practice. You're suspended effective immediately. You will leave the hospital in the next 15 minutes. He pulled a write-up form from his pocket, already filled out in his handwriting. Already signed. This is your formal termination notice. Brooke took the paper. The words blurred slightly because she didn't expect them to blur. She read them anyway. Violation of Hospital Policy 402.3, unauthorized medical intervention, performing procedures reserved for licensed physicians or advanced practice providers. The date was today. The effective date was today. The signature was Sterling's perfect cursive. He would have died, she said quietly. That's not your call to make, Ghost. You're done here. He turned and walked out. The name, Ghost, was the kind of detail that confirmed everything she'd suspected. He'd been thinking about how to remove her for weeks. Ghost was what he called her in his mind. The invisible nurse who'd made a mistake by speaking up about protocols and then a bigger mistake by saving a life in a way he couldn't control. Brooke changed out of her scrubs in the locker room. Her hands moved through the motions, the uniform coming off, the street clothes going on, like she was operating from a distance, like her body was a machine she was simply observing. The faded unit patch was in the jacket pocket where she'd kept it for 7 years. She pulled it out and held it for a long moment. The patch was from her unit at Camp Lejeune, faded to the color of old denim, the emblem barely visible. She'd worn a uniform with this insignia. She'd carried people out of fire wearing this symbol on her shoulder. She'd been someone then. The rain started as she drove to Riverview Cemetery. Not the kind of rain that politely fell, but the kind that hammered, that demanded acknowledgement, that sounded like applause for someone who'd failed at being invisible. David's grave was exactly where she'd left it. The stone read his name and the dates, 1982 to 2017, and the phrase she'd chosen, beloved husband. Chosen forever. She knelt in the wet grass, her street clothes soaking through in seconds because she didn't care about being dry anymore. The rain was cold. The earth was cold. Everything felt appropriate somehow. I tried to be small enough to survive, baby, she whispered to the stone. Her voice wasn't shaking. It was steady and even and broken. I tried to disappear completely. To heal in silence. To not hurt anyone. To just be someone nobody noticed. And I still failed. I still couldn't stop being who I was. One patient. One moment. And the whole thing collapsed. I'm so sorry. The rain hammered. She stayed there until the time her shift would have ended, until the evening crew would be arriving, until Morrison's vitals would have been checked and rechecked, until Sterling would have begun calculating his next move. She stayed until the cold worked through all her layers and into the place she'd been trying to keep numb since Baghdad. Then she drove home to the apartment that didn't feel like home, and she waited for something she didn't have words for yet. The moment came at 4 in the morning, not a call, but the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. A text from an unknown number. This is Emily Morrison. We need to talk about you. Can you come to Sacred Heart today at 10 a.m.? She didn't know what she was walking toward. She only knew that this was how it always ended. The mask came off. The past found you. The quiet didn't last forever. Jake Morrison's eyes focused on the ceiling tiles for the first time in 72 hours without the morphine softening everything into watercolor. The world sharpened. The ventilator hiss became distinct from his own breathing. The monitors beeped in sequence, digital confirmation that his body was still there, still fighting, still his. He flexed his fingers. Both hands responded. He moved his toes. Both feet obeyed. The pneumothorax Brooke Sullivan had decompressed yesterday had left him tethered to tubes, but the fog was lifting, and with it came something sharper than pain, memory. By evening, the physical therapist, a woman whose name he couldn't hold on to, helped him to his feet. 12 steps to the corridor. 13. His left leg remembered something close to strength. They were moving toward the nurse's station when her voice cut through the hallway's ambient noise like a flare shot into the dark. She was speaking to another nurse, her tone level and professional, but underneath the cadence was something Morrison's body recognized before his mind did. A particular way of saying words. A particular way of being certain. The kind of certainty that came from having held other people's lives in your hands while artillery rattled the windows. His physical therapist felt him stop. Felt the sudden hardness in his grip. Mr. Morrison. He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The woman at the nurse's station turned slightly, and he saw her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the scar tissue on her left hand visible even at this distance, the way she stood as if ready to move in any direction. Her name badge read, B. Sullivan, R.N. One word came out, raw and certain as a sniper's breath, Reaper. She turned. Their eyes met. And in that instant, the Arctic Circle froze between them. The floor nurse whose chart she'd been reviewing turned to stare. The physical therapist's hand tightened on Morrison's arm in alarm. But Brooke Sullivan's face remained absolutely still, not blank, but controlled in a way that only people who've been trained to survive catastrophe can control anything. She set down the chart. She took a measured breath. And then she walked toward him with a kind of careful precision that suggested she was making a very deliberate choice about how to do it. "Hello, Jake," she said. Her voice was lower than hospital protocol required, and that alone made everything real. She didn't touch him. Didn't smile. Didn't cry. She simply stood there in her scrubs with her scarred hands at her sides, and let him look at her long enough to confirm what 7 years and a haze of morphine had stolen. This was the woman who'd carried him out of Fallujah when his right shoulder had come apart under fire. This was Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, call sign Reaper, except she was wearing a hospital ID badge and her hair was longer and her face had lines that hadn't been there when the dust was still settling over the Jolan district. Morrison's physical therapist was asking if he needed to sit down. He wasn't hearing her. He was remembering the exact moment in the surgical theater when Brooke's hands had come into view, steady, competent, surgical, and her voice had said, "Needle going in." Second intercostal space. Decompressing now. He was remembering that the pressure in his chest had released like exhale. He was remembering that she'd looked at him afterward and said, "You've got another 40 years in you if you're stupid enough to want them." "I didn't know," Morrison said. "I didn't recognize you." "You weren't supposed to," Brooke said quietly. "I didn't come here as Reaper. I came here as a nurse." The physical therapist gently redirected him back to his room. Brooke didn't follow. She returned to her chart work with the same measured movements, the same composure that had allowed her to function in a war zone and carry his 240-pound body through mortar fire without breaking her breathing pattern. But her hands trembled slightly as she wrote. Just slightly. Just enough to confirm that she was human. Just enough to confirm that seeing him awake and clear-eyed, actually conscious of who she was and what she'd done, had cost her something. Within 4 hours, his daughter Emily was in Portland. She'd been waiting outside Sacred Heart's main entrance when Morrison called her, something ragged in his voice that she'd never heard before, and she'd dropped her briefing at the Seattle office and driven I-5 in 3 hours and 14 minutes, her hands tight on the steering wheel and her mind cycling through the possibilities. Her father had been cryptic on the phone. "The woman from my past is here," he'd said, and Emily's first thought was an affair, some complication from his marriage that he'd never disclosed. But that wasn't the story that took shape as he pulled her into his hospital room and closed the door and began to speak. "The tattoo," he said, and he held out his left forearm. Emily had asked about it 1,000 times over her life. Her father's skin bore a woman's name in military block letters, faded now with time. Reaper. No other context. He'd never answered any of her questions directly, just said, "Someone I owed my life to." "Leave it at that." "Brooke Sullivan," Emily whispered, understanding suddenly spreading through her like cold water. "The nurse downstairs." "Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan," Morrison corrected. His voice held the kind of reverence usually reserved for prayer. "She was a SEAL team leader. Navy. She pulled me out of Baghdad when everything was burning." Emily's hands were shaking as she left her father's room and walked to the nurse's station where Brooke Sullivan was updating a patient's chart. The woman looked up at the sound of Emily's approach, and Emily could see the recognition happen in real time, a professional assessment of incoming family member transforming into something that looked a lot like dread. "You're Jake Morrison's daughter," Brooke said. "Not a question." "He has your name tattooed on his arm," Emily said, her voice shaking. "He's had it for 7 years. He never explained. He just said you carried him home." Brooke set down her pen. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above them. The smell of antiseptic and industrial cleaner hung in the air like a ghost of certainty. "I did what was required," Brooke said quietly. "He says you're Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. He says you extracted 12 people under fire. He says you did it twice." The words hung between them. Brooke's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible response, but Emily was watching closely enough to catch it. She reached past Brooke and opened the computer system that held employee records, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd worked in hospital administration for a decade. She pulled up the military records section and entered a name. The system took 3 seconds to populate the file. The decorations listed on Brooke Sullivan's military record started with simple ones and escalated like a body count. Combat Action Ribbon. Expert Infantryman Badge. Navy Unit Commendation. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And at the top of the list, typed in with the gravity of something that existed in fewer than 100 military files in the entire country, Navy Cross. Emily read them aloud. Her voice cracked twice. Behind them, a man's footsteps stopped. Dr. Sterling had emerged from his office to see what was happening at the nurse's station, and his face went white in stages as Emily continued reading. Not the slow pale of illness, but the sudden bloodless white of someone watching their calculation collapse in real time. His hand came up to steady himself against the wall. Emily felt Brooke's presence shift beside her, not fear, but awareness. The particular awareness of a predator noticing that the hunt had turned, that she was no longer prey but something far more dangerous. The next morning, a man arrived at Sacred Heart who moved like military installations moved, with absolute authority and zero acknowledgement of civilian resistance. Retired SEAL Commander David Holloway wore his years like a medal and his bearing like a weapon, and he requested a meeting with Dr. Sterling in the administrator's conference room. What he brought was a file containing extraction records from FOB Shank in Logar Province, dated 7 years prior. What he brought was radio communications transcripts from the Battle of Fallujah. What he brought was testimony from 11 survivors of those operations, each of whom swore under penalty of perjury that Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had performed her duties with extraordinary valor under fire. What he brought was the specific tactical evidence that she had, on 2 separate occasions, risked her life to ensure that every member of her team returned home. She saved him twice, Holloway said, his voice level. Once in the desert. Once in this hospital. That woman performed an emergency needle decompression that saved Army Ranger Morrison's life, and Dr. Sterling decided to use her medical judgment, her correct medical judgment, as grounds for termination. Sterling's mouth moved. No sound came out. There are 2 federal agents in the lobby, Holloway continued. They are here regarding an anonymous tip about fraudulent employee records in your department. Seems someone used the hospital's personnel system to forge continuing education credits and fabricate patient outcome data over the course of 18 months. Seems that person was you, and the motivation was a hospital grant that required specific efficiency metrics to secure funding. The color drained from Sterling's face in stages. His hands began to shake. Not from fear, but from the particular shock of a man watching the architecture of his power collapse in real time. The FBI agents didn't use drama. They simply walked past Sterling's frozen form, noted his authorization on their warrant, and accessed his departmental files with the methodical certainty of people who'd done this before. What they found was systematic fraud, fabricated performance reviews, falsified patient outcomes, altered continuing education records, and a pattern of grant applications that depended entirely on numbers that had never existed. They found emails where Sterling had pressured the external investigator Dr. Walsh to find violations in Brooke Sullivan's credentials before the investigation had even begun. They found the communications between Sterling and board member Patricia Hendricks where he'd asked her to handle the nurse problem while offering absolutely nothing of value in return except the promise that she'd look good to the board. Within 3 hours, Patricia Hendricks had resigned. Within 4 hours, Dr. Raymond Walsh had voluntarily submitted all communications with Sterling to Hospital Legal. By evening, Sacred Heart CEO Dr. Angela Morrison held an emergency board meeting. The decision took 12 minutes. Dr. Sterling was terminated immediately, his medical license suspended pending criminal charges, and the hospital issued a formal public apology to Brooke Sullivan with an offer of full reinstatement at her previous position with back pay for the period of her suspension. The walkout was neither quick nor merciful. Sterling was escorted by 2 federal agents through the same hallways where he'd orchestrated her humiliation. They passed the unit board where her termination notice had been posted in letters large enough for family members to read. He was handcuffed in view of every person who'd been in the break room during his dressing down of her competence. The agents placed his head gently against the car door, the kind of procedural courtesy that made it clear he wasn't being treated as a serious threat, just as a bureaucratic problem that needed to be filed away. 6 months later, Brooke Sullivan returned to Sacred Heart not as a floor nurse but as a clinical instructor for emergency trauma procedures. The position had been created for her, the hospital had no budget for it, so they'd made one. She taught residents the needle decompression technique that had saved Jake Morrison's life, standing at a teaching podium and saying, "Speed matters. Precision matters. But what matters most is the will to act when acting is terrifying." Morrison attended one of her classes on the anniversary of his second save, walking without assistance, his daughter Emily beside him. He'd brought something, a framed photograph from their unit in Baghdad, taken 7 years prior. Brooke's face was younger in it, harder, still sharp with the edges that war carved into people. She was standing beside Morrison in the desert, and her expression was the pure focus of someone whose job was to keep her people alive. She accepted the photograph silently. "You carried me home twice," Morrison said. "I'll never forget again." "You don't need to remember," Brooke replied. Her voice had changed. It carried authority now, the full weight of her rank, no longer hidden beneath hospital protocol. "You just needed to survive. Sterling's fate reached her through hospital gossip 3 weeks later. Criminal charges had resulted in 18 months probation, permanent loss of his medical license, and a lifetime ban from healthcare administration. He was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table at a strip mall off Interstate 205, his office wedged between a vape shop and a payday loan store. His business card listed no credentials. His office smelled like old coffee and desperation. Brooke drove past it once, saw him sitting alone behind the folding table, and felt nothing. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Not anything at all. He had become irrelevant, a cautionary tale for younger doctors about what happened when you mistook compliance for weakness. She kept the faded unit patch pinned inside her locker, the one Morrison's daughter had found sewn inside his jacket lining all those years ago. She'd asked for it after seeing the photograph, and Emily had placed it in her hands with the reverence of someone returning a relic. The patch was worn almost invisible at the edges, but the insignia remained clear, the symbol of the unit she'd led, the unit that had followed her into places where following meant accepting that you might not follow back out. On quiet shifts, when the emergency department held its breath between crises, she would open that locker door and look at the patch. It was a reminder of a simple fact that most people never learned: some people never forget who carried them home. Not because they're sentimental. Because survival changes you at a cellular level. Because when someone holds your life in their hands and chooses to keep holding it even when letting go would have been easier, something bonds you together that time and distance and 7 years of forgotten morphine haze cannot break. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone. The antiseptic smell clung to everything like proof of purpose. But Brooke Sullivan wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a clinical instructor with a rank that meant something again. She was Reaper, and this time, she wasn't hiding. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments, we'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.